When you have a relationship with Jesus, you can have access to God and enjoy all the benefits of his promises. If you do something that's intentionally against God's will, like not forgiving somebody, even though God said you have to, it's going to cost you. Most of you know the story, but I'll try and keep it short for those who may not have heard it before. I talked about anger, strong feeling of intense displeasure, hostility, indignation as a result of real or imagined threat. Forgiveness is giving up the resentment against someone and giving up our right to get even no matter what has been done to us. You know that I haven't seen my kids for decades. It's my fault. It isn't their fault. They say, well, how could those kids do that? Because if you go back to the resentment that I had when the divorce immediately happened, whenever my wife left me after 20 years, my mind snapped. One of my first phone calls, and this will make you laugh, was to a suicide hotline. I said, my wife has divorced me. I want to kill myself. And they said, well, we can get you in on the 30th of the month or the 10th of the next month. I says, I want to commit suicide today. And I just said, F you, and hung up. You can't rely on people to do the right thing, but you can always rely on God to tell you the right thing to do. Well, God told me the right thing to do. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. But I didn't follow that either. I have to plead guilty. I was crazy. Is it possible that I could say not guilty by reason of insanity? Well, I actually had some insanity that lasted for decades. And the reason that the kids were so angry at me is the revenge that I got against their mother by, for the first few years, not sending any support money. Not the first husband that's ever done that. That cost them a lot. Other things that I did were vengeful and unforgiving, and the long and short of it is, as you know, the kids were hurt so deeply I haven't seen my kids in over 3 decades. I may or may not ever see them again. I pray that I see them in heaven. But there's always a residual for any sin that you do. It's like James Dobson told the story of Samson and Delilah. You know the story where she kept after him to try and find out the reason for his strength and why he was so strong and men couldn't possibly beat him at what he did.
Make a point about
it's important for us to do what God said and keep our covenants with God. Samson broke his covenant with God, told her what the secret was. They cut his hair, which was a sign of his strength, and they made him a slave. They poked out his eyes. He got his relationship back with God, so much so that he was able to go to the temple and push down the pillars of the temple and kill all the bad people. But as James Dobson reminded us, it reminded me when I heard him tell this story, Samson was still blind. It was like 10 or 20 years later. I mean, yeah, he was forgiven for his sin. Yeah, he reestablished his relationship. Like in my case, I've been forgiven by God. I've reestablished myself as with a relationship with God. These sins are behind me, and God's forgiven me for those sins. But the residual of that is the separation from my family, which, as I told you, I started naming my kids when I was 7 years old. I knew there'd be a Bridget Brady and a Blaze Brady and a Brooke Brady. These are names that came to me when I was 7 years old, knowing that I'd be a daddy. So the sin that I committed by not sending the support money for a few years, I eventually paid it all. But
Still paying.
And I'm still paying, yeah, because of my sin back then. The court said, all right, yeah, you've paid all the support money that was behind, but there's interest on that. And so we pay now for the rest of my life support money from a divorce back in 1991.
But that's something I wanted to just mention. It's consequence of not forgiving. There's consequence in not forgiving. I think we forget that. Sometimes if we realize if we don't forgive, we have the ability. Forgiving is not easy. Forgiving is not saying that it's right, that what they've done to you is right or wrong or whatever. Forgiving is the ability to let go and let God go ahead and take care of the situation. But to me, the biggest thing that I learned so quickly in life when I was just a teenager, when things were happening to me so brutal and things that happened. So most of you know I was gang raped, all kinds of things happened. I was almost killed. the thing was, is God spoke to me so clearly, and I was in the Word. Thank goodness I knew the Lord at an early age. And he literally would tell me, when I would think of something, he says, forgiveness is mine. I'll take care of it if you'll let me. And so I had to realize, if it's yours, remember I tell you things make sense to me. If it's his, then it's not mine. I mean, it's so simple. If it's his, it's not mine. And so I was just easy to believe, say, well, if it's yours, then I guess it's not mine. It sounds so simple. But when I let him take care of those things, he just said, okay, it's up to you. Doesn't mean it's okay. Didn't mean I didn't have boundaries. Doesn't mean that I accepted their behaviors if they're still doing it. Doesn't mean that you don't protect yourself. Do you see what I mean? It isn't, doesn't mean that I don't, forgiving and forgetting, that's debatable. I forget, but I'm intelligent enough to know not to get myself in that situation again. See, that's because if I did totally forget, I could just be dumb and go right back into it. So there's things that you do have consequences. And when I learned to forgive very quickly, and I realized something else. It was a choice. Forgiveness is a choice. And I get to choose it as an act of my will. I can say, God, when you don't know how to forgive, you just say, God, as an act of, you say I should forgive. Why? Because you can't forgive me if I don't forgive them. That's huge too. That's huge. Our prayers are hindered because if I'm not forgiving people, God can't forgive me. He can't hear me. In relationships like family or husband and wife, we have a connection. The two become one. If he's not hearing me, guess what? He's not hearing him. Okay, we're one in God's eyes. So what happens is you have consequences. And when you realize, I don't want the consequences that nature will give, but I can, as an act of my will, I would say, God, and when I didn't feel like forgiving, doesn't mean I always felt like it, but after a while it becomes second nature, because now I forgive immediately. I don't get offended either. Why? It's an act of my will to not get offended. I know it makes it sound simple, but it is. I choose as an act of my will, God, I will forgive. You ask me to forgive, I choose to forgive. Now, when I don't feel like I'm forgiving, I'll say, God, this is in your hands. This is yours. I'll put it back over him. It says when you can't have more than you can handle, you give that back to God. It says cast your cares over to him. Cast them. Throw them on him. So when we have cares that we have, that those lack of forgiveness is a burden. It starts being burdensome. It starts affecting us. So see, forgiveness is not as important to others necessarily as it is for us, because it's hurting us. It gives us unforgiveness, leads us into, remember, guilty. We feel guilty. Every time we're around them, oh, there they are. Oh my gosh. And you'll notice your behavior starts to change, doesn't it? The way you respond to them. If you see them in the hall, ugh, there they are. You go the other way. You see them in the mall or whatever you want to do. You avoid them. That's totally changing your behavior. The Lord spoke to me one time in the hall when I had a lady that just totally different than I thought as a professional. She acted totally unprofessional in my room. And so what I did is I forgave her, I know I forgave her, but I found myself wanting to avoid her. And so I asked the Lord, wow, that's not very good, because now and he says, he really spoke to me so heavily. He says, are you going to allow her to change who you are because of what she did? Who I am, change who I am. I thought, oh, I am. I normally say, good morning, God bless you. That's me. That's what. And so instead I was doing something different. I thought, I am doing something different around her. So I shouldn't. And he said, you're going to allow that much power? You're going to give her that power? And I never thought of it that way. I'm giving them that power over me. They literally are changing me. Does that make sense? They changed me. And I thought, I'm not doing that anymore. So the next day I said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to let her change who I am and the way I behave and what I do in a group. Because if she's in the group, I'm affected by her being in the group. So what I did is the next day I just said, good morning. And I get that. Yeah. And so I thought, that's fine, because I'm going to do what I can do, and she's going to have to take care and be responsible for what she does. Do you know what I mean? And sometimes when you ask people for forgiveness or ask them to forgive you, have you ever had them say no? That's fine. That's okay. You know why? You have done what God's asked you to do. This is so cool to remember. When you forgive someone, it's an act of your will, whether they accept it or not. You can't change that. That's up to them. That's their walk. Okay? So you have to and then you just go on and do your life. It isn't that you're just going to rub them out. Does that make sense? Let them be what they are. You can't make somebody say forgiveness. Just because you ask forgiveness, they're not going to say, oh yeah, okay. And it's just like in fact, on the vacation that I had, I was telling Ed, I had visited my sister. And I knew that there was some kind of barrier, that she's younger than I am, there was some kind of barrier between us. And have you ever been around people and just something's not quite right? You may not have that, but I have. I can tell. I have a real discerning spirit, so I can usually read people very well. It's a gift. Discernment is a gift, and you use it over and over, and God gets it better and better. I can tell somebody's upset or mad, no matter what they're looking like to everybody else, just the way I am. God's given me a gift for that. So with my sister, I'd always thought, something's not right. And I'd always ask her, are you okay, or whatever. I'd never get an answer, and then I couldn't read her. Well, an incident happened there, and we've confronted it, and I said, she'd said something, I said, absolutely not. I'm not going to let you believe that. And I just said, what you're saying is incorrect. And what I found out, it was so amazing, and this may be what Ed's example was about, she had had a thought, and this incident happened to her 30 years ago between her and I. 30. Now, that may not mean much to you, but it was something she believed that was incorrect, that she never asked me to explain or address. She just assumed something. And she's kind of like that sometimes. Maybe you know people like that. They don't confront. She's not a confronter. I'm a confronter. That's why. But what I'm trying to get at, there was something she didn't forgive me about. I didn't even know I needed forgiveness about something, because I did what I thought was best for me and my daughter, and things that had happened. I had to flee from my family, for 10 years, things like that. She couldn't understand it, but she took it as a personal affront. But I didn't realize that. So what happened is we addressed something that was very difficult, lasted till about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. But in this situation, this is somebody that I've loved her whole life. And for her to think I had done something I never intended was very hard for me.